Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for another edition of Coffee at Kerr, co-presented with Arizona Opera. Since the pandemic began, we've turned these normally in-person and very popular events into a live stream. So we do appreciate you tuning in today. And hopefully, if you know some people who cannot tune in for the live thing, you will share this link with them so they can watch it after the fact. All of our content stays archived on our YouTube channel, and we do recommend that you subscribe at youtube.com/ASUKERR. That way you'll get notifications every time we go live and you won't miss anything. The next shows that we have coming up, and March is jam-packed in this last few days of the month. On Thursday, our Beams Live Music series, we will have African world music performer Chinobe. He will be performing from his secret lair full of sacred African instruments, and since the pandemic began, he's been doing a lot of live looping and sampling to take place of the other musicians he normally performs with. So if you like soothing melodies, kalimba, kora, handmade acoustic instruments, this is definitely a show you will want to tune in for. Watch just as you are right now on our YouTube, Facebook Live, and Twitch. Our Tea series, Tuesday Morning Music and Tea, that we co-present with the ASU School of Music is coming up next Tuesday as well. Those are daytime shows just like this. 10:30 a.m. we will kick off with ASU Flute Studio students of Dr. Elizabeth Buck. They'll be performing works from contemporary composers and taking your questions just like we're doing today. We're so excited to hand it over to Dr. Schildkret today. Miriam Schildkret is a teaching education artist with Arizona Opera, and she is wildly talented. You will hear her speak, you'll see her wonderful presentation, and she's even going to sing a bit for us. And we're so happy to turn it over to Dr. Miriam Schildkret.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here virtually, of course. As you heard, my name is Dr. Miriam Schildkret. I'm actually the second Dr. Schildkret that you all have heard from. There are 3 of us total in the world, if you can believe it. And as you heard, I am an education teaching artist with Arizona Opera. What that usually means is that we do shorter versions of operas for elementary and middle school students across the state of Arizona. But since the pandemic hit, I've been fortunate enough to go into high school classrooms as well, virtually, talking about health, opera history, performance anxiety, lots of amazing topics. I also am an alum from ASU. I got my master's degree in 2014 in opera performance and my doctoral degree in 2017 in voice performance. So I'm so excited to be here, combining 2 of my favorite institutions here in Arizona for this presentation. Today, we're going to be talking a bit about opera history, but through a lens that not many people look at, looking at the evolution of children in opera. I, of course, am very passionate about children. I teach them all the time. I love showing them and introducing them to the world of opera. And what started as just a kind of question of why do composers choose to write roles for women versus children? I sing a lot of these roles, by the way. As a mezzo-soprano, I sing a lot of what are called trouser roles, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But it started as this question of why composers chose to write for women versus children, and it turned into this fascinating topic, seeing so much about the history of childhood, how that relates to opera, and some of the implications that are there. So that is what we're going to be talking about today. So in general, the presence of children in opera really closely relates to the history of childhood. So in order to understand this evolution in opera, I think it's really important to know a little bit about this history of childhood. The study of childhood is a relatively new field. When I was looking into this topic, most of the resources I was able to find were from the very earliest in the 1960s. So it's a really, really new field. Scholars are just now starting to delve into this history. One of the most fascinating statements that I read was this, that no concept of childhood existed prior to the 17th century. I was really surprised by that when I first read it. And what historians and scholars are referring to here is artwork from before the 17th century. They're looking at medieval and Baroque art and noticing that children look kind of like miniature adults. So if you see on your screen this Madonna and Child from circa 1290 to 1300, this portrait of the baby Jesus here really does look like a miniature adult that they just kind of squeezed down and made to look like a child. They also aren't really seeing in artwork children having clothing that are really particularly for children, or toys, or even holding a posture or an attitude that we consider children to have. And part of the reasons why scholars think that this concept of childhood didn't really exist before the 17th century is because of the idea of original sin. Of course, children were around. We wouldn't have been able to evolve if we didn't have children, but they more were here for through necessity to move along the bloodline. But children were seen as part of the problem of original sin. They were seen more as pests and a nuisance and just something that you had to have, versus this epitome of innocence that we think of with children later in history, or, a group of people that need to be protected and cared for. So historians see this shift around the 17th century. So we have another piece of art here, the portrait of a young boy from circa 1637. And here, I think this boy, he does look like a child. His face has those puffy, rosy cheeks, but his posture is still kind of adult. He looks like he's really holding himself very maturely. We don't see any toys depicted with him either. So it's absolutely a shift, an ongoing change over the course of history. So the big time period that we really look at when we talk about the evolution of childhood and children's rights is looking at the 19th century. It's during the mid-19th century that we start to see the government intervene when it comes to child's livelihood. So we see them intervene about child labor laws, about child's right to an education, and protecting them from abuse and neglect. And historians see this as a pretty important shift. So I noted two really notable examples of some of this legislation that we see during the mid to late 19th century, both of which are from England. The first was the Education Act of 1876. This prohibited children from working between the ages of 5 to 10, and then children between the ages of 10 to 13 had to demonstrate that they had a certain level of education before they were allowed to be employed in the mills or factories or wherever it was that they were working. So, of course, the 19th century was during the Industrial Revolution. This was a huge time period that children were being utilized in factories, and the hours and the abuse that these children faced is pretty horrific. It's to read some of these cases from these children is quite tough to read at times. And part of the reason children were employed was because they were cheap labor. They were easy to hire, and you didn't have to pay them as much as an apprentice or an adult. And at first, scholars thought that these children being employed showed, just furthered that idea that parents didn't really care about their children, but they also saw that wasn't quite true. Most parents kind of felt stuck in employing these children in these mills and factories. Part of this was because education wasn't free or mandatory for children during this time period, not until this Education Act of 1876. Beforehand, if you wanted to educate your children, that really fell onto the parent. So this then led to some classist behavior, of course, right? If you were wealthy enough either to afford a tutor or that you had been educated yourself and could teach your child basic arithmetic, reading, writing, history, then you could teach your child. But if you yourself didn't know how to read or write, how could you teach your child to do that? And in fact, those lower income families often needed the extra income from their children. So it kind of became this vicious cycle. And the Education Act in England was meant to stop that cycle. A few years later, we also see the Prevention of Cruelty to Children Act, also known as the Children's Charter, in 1889. And this allowed the government to intervene in cases of abuse and neglect and take children away into a separate kind of foster home. We also start to see foster homes crop up in France and Germany, all over Europe. So similarly with the abuse that children saw at the mills and the factories where they were working, during this time period, children were seen as the epitome of innocence and they needed to be protected. But the government didn't think it was necessarily their place to intervene at the home. What a parent chose to do to discipline their child was between that parent and that child. It wasn't the government's responsibility until the end of the century when they went, beating your child probably isn't discipline, that's just abuse. Or on the flip side, neglect also is abuse. Finally, the concept of adolescence is even newer. That appears in the 20th century and is an ongoing thing today as young adults stay in university later and later, as they wait to get married, to buy houses, to have children. It's an ongoing thing. So when we're looking at a lot of these operas from prior to the 20th century, I think it's really important to keep that lens in mind, that there wasn't really an idea of a teenager before then. It doesn't really start to come up until we start seeing adults treating children differently when they're around the age of puberty, kind of noticing that shift that we go through during puberty. So, what do we consider, or who do we consider to be a child in opera? There are a few things that I look at when I'm looking at these characters. Number one is, how old are they? I generally think if a character is 14 years or younger, then they are a child. But more important than that age is how that character is being treated in the story. Do they show that childlike innocence that was so important during the 19th century? Do they have a prepubescent sense of sexuality, meaning that if they are thinking about love, it's a pretty naive sense of love, and they don't necessarily have that sex drive that we associate with adults? And finally, their dependence on adults, whether it's financial dependence, needing advice from the adults around them, really looking for that mentorship that children crave. So the example that I like to give for this criteria is the character of Juliet from Romeo and Juliet. She is generally agreed to be about 13 years old. So age-wise, she would fall into the category of child. But I think you can see where I'm going with this. I do not consider Juliet to be a child because she doesn't meet these other criteria. She is treated like an adult. She goes through many adult situations in that play and subsequently the opera. So Juliet, I would consider a child. In general, as we go forward, looking at this evolution of children in opera, the more rights that children are getting in society, the more they're treated with respect and care and love, the more we start to see child roles in opera, the younger these roles become, and we start to see actual children portraying these child roles. So children didn't really appear in opera before the French Revolution. We don't really see child characters at all, whether they're played by adults or children. And the first major type of role that we see, major type of child character, is this archetypal character of the page. This was by far the most prominent child character in the late 18th century, and it had some similar characteristics anytime this character showed up in opera. He's always a trouser role, which is a woman portraying a male character. He's usually between the ages of 12 to 14 years old, so what we would consider nowadays to be a teenager, but of course then they didn't have an idea of adolescence, so it's more kind of that in-between awkward child phase. He is a secondary character, and his music is much lighter than the other characters in the opera. He sings arietas, ariosos, or, his music is up-tempo. He provides comic relief to the story, especially if the story is a tragedy, and he is infatuated with the idea of love, but most importantly, he never achieves that love that he so craves. So I like to talk a little bit about this idea of the trouser role, of why. This was my first question I had. Why did composers write for women instead of children? And there are a couple reasonings that scholars kind of agree on. The first is the aesthetic of that treble voice portraying that lower voice type, or that male character, I should say. This comes from the idea of castrati, which were really important and famous and used all the time in Baroque opera. Castrati played the younger heroes in operas, and so many historians believe that audiences were used to that higher aesthetic when portraying these younger male characters, so that could have been a holdover for why they chose to have a woman sing these roles. It was the closest they could get to that castrati sound. But there are a couple other things going on. One is that these women playing those boy characters were not actually meant to fool the audience into thinking that it was a boy on stage. During this time period, they found seeing that woman on stage in pants aesthetically pleasing and also comical. This is why we're often seeing characters like Cherubino and the Marriage of Figaro being drawn attention to the fact that it is an actress playing that character. Cherubino is that they're always referring to how feminine he looks. Susanna at one point compares her skin to Cherubino's and says, wow, your skin is very fair, fairer than mine, almost like a girl's. And of course, everyone in the audience is like, ha, 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 it is a girl, right? And then furthermore, we see Cherubino getting dressed up as a girl. In Act 3, he shows up with the women's chorus. And so then you have this fun thing of an actress pretending to be a boy who is now pretending to be a girl. But the final thing that scholars agree on is that this was also a way to look at a woman's body. Keep in mind that during the 18th century, women were wearing very large skirts, and even showing your ankle would have been very scandalous. So to see a woman in tights and pants was aesthetically pleasing to a lot of the straight men in the audience. So it has kind of this sinister, misogynistic undertone that, of course, we have when we look at the history of opera, or we're looking at a history when feminism wasn't really around yet. So I wanted to give you all an example of some of the music that you would hear. So we're going to perform, me and Chris Cano, the aria Non so più cosa son from The Marriage of Figaro. This is by that same character, Cherubino. He is based on the character Cherubin from Le Mariage de Figaro. And even Beaumarchais says that Cherubin should be played by a young and very pretty woman. So while I will try to act like a 12-year-old boy, of course, keep in mind that Beaumarchais wanted a young woman to play that part. So, non so più cosa son, putting on my performer hat now. Non so più cosa son, cosa faccio, or di fuoco la suona di piaccio, ogni donna che certi calore, ogni donna mi fa palpitar, ogni donna mi fa palpitar, ogni donna mi fa palpitar. Solo in nome d'amor diletto, mi si turba il sangue del petto, mi sforza d'amore, this aria. It's such a great example of this character and of this final point that he is infatuated with the idea of love. Hopefully you could hear Cherubino's just inner excitement about all these new feelings that he's experiencing as a young boy, or as a young man, not boy, teenager. And this is a really important thing with this trouser role. They're infatuated with this idea of love, but they don't achieve this love that they so desire. And historians think that this was another reason why these characters were played by women, that during this time period, they consider this cross-dressing casting to kind of cancel out these characters' sense of sexual desire, as it were, that because they are genderless, they are then not able to achieve sexual desire. Of course, through a modern lens, we know that could not be less true. Then reading homosexual scholars' ideas of these characters is that they find it very empowering to see these non-binary characters still singing about love and wanting to achieve that love gives them a way to see themselves reflected on stage. So the evolution of the page comes to a head with the character Octavian from Der Rosenkavalier. And I will give the side note that Octavian I don't consider to be a child, but I think he's important to talk about because he brings this cycle full circle. He is a trouser role. He's sung by a woman. He's a little bit older than Pages. He's 18 years old, but then he breaks every other rule in the book about Pages. He is the main character. His music can be lighter. He can provide comic relief, but he also has some incredibly virtuosic singing that he has to do. And he is the center of the love triangle in that story. When Der Rosenkavalier was premiered, it met a lot of criticism from critics. This opera, if you've never seen it before, begins with a love scene between the Marschallin and Octavian. And many, many critics just were horrified by this. They talked about the overt lesbianism in the opera, which when I was reading this in the 21st century, I went, that's funny. Yes, it's two actresses, but it's still a heterosexual relationship. But some critics would go so far as saying, why didn't Strauss just write this for a tenor? And then we would avoid all this lesbianism, as they said. And many people believe that the reason why Strauss chose to use a page was partly to show this comparison between Octavian and Cherubino and the other pages that came after him, but also because casting a woman in this role allows for, in love scenes, in duets, for those voices to physically touch, those notes to touch in a way that a man's and woman's cannot. And it creates this incredibly sensual, beautiful experience. In my opinion, the presentation of the Rose is the best example of love at first sight. And I think it's because of this aesthetic that we create. So, yes, I'm seeing a couple questions. Let's see. Cho-Cho-san in Butterfly is 15 at the beginning of the opera. Isn't she really a child at first? This is an excellent question. Yes. I think that's part of the tragedy about Cho-Cho-san in Madame Butterfly is that she is childlike. She says that, oh, I am only 15 years old, right? She considers herself to be a child, and yet she has to so quickly become an adult when she is abandoned by Pinkerton, when she is abandoned with her child, when Pinkerton comes back and then is going to take her child away from her. Of course, this growing up into being a woman so horribly and suddenly, I think, leads to her death. So we see a lot of sinister things here. Yes, I love this. What are some good operas the best aunt and uncle in the world can bring kids to? I think we'll talk about this a little bit more in the end of what I think would be great operas. And maybe some of these that we'll talk about, you can decide which ones would be great to take them to. So we move forward in our evolution of child characters in opera. As we move into the 19th century, we start to see more children appear, and they're younger. So the first is seeing boys' choruses appear around the mid-19th century. An excellent example is in Bizet's Carmen, but they're in a lot of grand operas during this time. We also start to see adults playing younger child roles in the late 19th century. So for instance, Fyodor in Mussorgsky's Boris Godunov, which was in 1874. And then Once we get to the end of the 19th century, keep in mind, this is now once we've had laws about child labor, about education, and about abuse and neglect. Children now have more rights. We start to see these young child characters being portrayed as principal roles in opera. But these characters are always played by adults. Also, at the same time, we start to see children, actors, receiving bit roles in operas. We see a speaking role for a boy in Tchaikovsky's Pique Dame in 1890. There's a boy solo in Act 2 of Puccini's La Bohème in 1896. Of course, in Puccini's Madame Butterfly, there is a boy who is a main character, though he is mute. He doesn't speak. Trouble, Cho-Cho-san's son. So I think a great example to look at these principal child roles played by women, by adults, is looking at Hensel and Gretel, written in 1893 by Humperdinck. This is by far Humperdinck's most popular opera. It was also the first opera he ever wrote, so he went out with a bang. And the title roles of Hansel and Gretel are written for women, and there's a couple reasons for this. One is that Humperdinck's writing is incredibly virtuosic. His orchestration is almost Wagnerian in the way that it's written. Fun side note, Richard Strauss, who wrote Der Rosenkavalier that we were talking about before, conducted the premiere. And he said of Hansel and Gretel, "It's devilishly difficult, this little Hansel." And it is. I've sung a few scenes from it. This picture that you see is from our outreach version of Hensel and Gretel. And some of the music really is quite difficult. And in order to sing it, while the women playing the characters will take on a physicality and act like children, we don't make our voices sound like children. Because if we did, we wouldn't be able to be heard over the orchestra and maybe not even be able to sing some of the music that Humperdinck wrote. So that's one reason. Another, I think, has to do with the subject matter. So the story of Hensel and Gretel, the opera, I should say, was written by Humperdinck's sister. It was a family affair. In fact, the father kind of referred to it as the family headache because so many people had differing opinions. But Humperdinck's sister, Adelheid Wet, wrote the libretto for Hensel and Gretel, and it is much tamer than the Grimm version of the fairy tale, and so much so that historians now believe that it wasn't actually based on the Grimm version, but rather another version written by Ludwig Bechstein. Bechstein's version had it still had a mother who sends these children into the woods to get food, but she is tired rather than, trying to be vindictive and get rid of the kids, like in Grimm's version of the fairy tale. The witch in Bechstein's version is also much more comical than in the Grimm fairy tale, where she is downright scary. And all of this is toned down even more in the opera. During this time period, in the late 19th century, it was believed that children really should only see fairy tales if they're seeing or being told stories, and that those stories that they were being told should not be too scary, that they shouldn't have too much violence, that they shouldn't have, sex depicted. Again, this was a time when children were seen as the epitome of innocence, and they needed to be protected at all costs. They now have these rights coming through the government. And I think that while Hansel and Gretel is a fairy tale, it's still one of the scarier fairy tales. And even in the opera, Hansel and Gretel are captured. Hansel is thrown in a cage. Gretel loses the ability to move of her own free will. And in the end, the two of them push the witch into the oven. So it's pretty scary stuff. Now we move, 50, 60 years later, and now we do have principal child roles played by children. You're asking, what is a great opera to take my kids to see? This one that we're about to talk about, Amal and the Night Visitors, is one of my absolute favorites. It would be a great one to take your children to see. This was written by Menotti in 1951. And this music, though he writes Amal purposefully for a boy soprano, and he does a couple things to make this possible. If we compare Amal and the Night Visitors to Hansel and Gretel, we see that the orchestra is much thinner. In fact, it's a chamber orchestra as opposed to the full orchestration that Humperdinck had. I think, though, there are some other reasonings why Menotti really wanted to make sure that he had a child playing the role of Amal. The relationship between the mother and Amal is really important to this story. It gives it its beauty, It's love. It's just incredibly touching and very realistic. And so in order to clarify that relationship, I think it makes it clearer if you have an actual child and a woman. That makes that much clearer than if you have two women portraying those roles. But Menotti also had several personal connections to this story. So he was commissioned to write an opera for television in 1951 around Christmas time, and he had writer's block. He didn't know what to write about. And so when he tells the story, he points out that when he was a child in Italy, that children were visited by the three kings as opposed to Santa Claus to bring them gifts. He talks about that they each had a favorite king. His brother's favorite king was Caspar, and his brother thought that Caspar might be a little hard of hearing because he often didn't bring the right gift. He'd mishear just a little, and that is in the opera. The king Caspar is constantly asking for characters to repeat their lines. It creates this great comedic effect. But then Menotti moved to the United States, and he forgot about the three kings. And so he's wandering through the Metropolitan Museum of Art, trying to figure out what he's going to write. This deadline is coming up for this TV opera, and he sees this painting, The Adoration of the Magi from circa 1475 by Hieronymus Bosch. Side note, look at this baby Jesus. I think he does look, kind of like a baby, but this is the time period where they're really miniature adults. And I think this pose that he has, I've never seen a baby do this. It's so funny. I love it. So Menotti sees this painting, and he says, let me find my quote. Okay, he goes, "And as I was looking at it, suddenly I heard it again, the weird song of the three kings. They had come back and brought me a gift. And that gift was the story of Amal and the Night Visitors, which features these three kings really prominently." The other kind of autobiographical point of this story was that Menotti himself was disabled. As a child, he had difficulty walking, and doctors and nurses had tried everything, and they weren't really finding any success. So as kind of a last resort, his nurse took him to the Madonna at the sanctuary of Sacromonte, which was known to have healing powers. She took him there, she prayed over him, and he miraculously was healed. He never had that disability again in his life. This, of course, is the pivotal moment in Amal and the Night Visitors. Amal is also disabled. He walks with a crutch. And at the end of the opera, he offers his crutch to the baby Jesus. And in doing that, having that selfless act, he's miraculously healed and he can walk. I get chills every time I think about it because that moment in the opera is so touching and moving. It's so beautiful. But the other important thing is that Menotti specified that Amal should not be a sweet little thing. In the 19th century, children, right, they were the epitome of innocence. They were angelic. They were sweet and wonderful all the time. And Menotti said, no. Amal should not be sweet. In fact, he's impish. He's a little devil. He lies, he makes up stories, and he acts like a kid. He misbehaves. Well, he doesn't lie a lot in the opera. The mother is clearly fed up with the stories that he tells, so much so that she doesn't believe him when he says that there are kings at the door coming to visit them. But also, we're starting to move a little bit away from the fairy tale genre. I think Amal and the Night Visitors has a lot of fairy tale aspect to it, but it also has a lot of realism. We see this mother and child who are very poor, who are not sure where their next meal is going to come from. We see Amal kind of coming to terms with that as he tells a story about how he had to sell his sheep, but also is excited about going begging because he's kind of trying to figure out this world that he's in. So then, just 3 years later, we get to the whole other side of the spectrum with the opera The Turn of the Screw, looking at the character Miles. This was written by Benjamin Britten in 1954. And like I said, we are now completely away from the fairy tale genre. This opera is based on the ghost story, on the short story by the same name by Henry James. And both in the short story and in the opera, there are some pretty heavy homosexual and pedophilic undertones to both stories. And there's also kind of an autobiographical nature to this opera for Benjamin Britten. Benjamin Britten was gay during a time period when it was illegal to be gay, so much so that you could be arrested. In fact, Oscar Wilde was famously arrested for being homosexual. Benjamin Britten was interviewed by the Scotland Yard at one point, though he wasn't actually arrested. So he wasn't open about his homosexuality, but it was common knowledge. It was common knowledge that he lived with his longtime partner, Peter Pierce, a tenor who he was often writing roles for in operas. But being gay in a time period when it was prosecuted to be gay really took a toll on Benjamin Britten's mental health. Almost all of his operas portray a story of an outcast of some kind. And most scholars believe that this was Britten really working through his own feeling of being outcast. And I think Turn of the Screw really shows his internal struggle with his sexuality. The character Miles in Turn of the Screw is pretty widely believed to also be gay. It says in the story and the opera that he was sent away for an injury to his friends, which many people believe to be that he was caught with a boy friend of his, either, hugging or kissing or doing something that seemed to indicate that he was gay. In the opera, he's always saying I'm bad, aren't I? Not because he broke something or because he acted out, just thinking that he is inherently a bad person. So the pedophilic overtones that we have in Turn of the Screw come from the relationship between Miles and the ghost of Peter Quint. If you don't know this story, either the short story or the opera, the premise is that there's a governess who goes to a house to take care of two children, a brother and a sister, and she quickly learns that both are being possessed by ghosts. And the story really focuses on this possession between Miles and Peter Quint, this kind of struggle that Miles is feeling of wanting to accept his nature, but also having this pretty sinister relationship from the ghost of Peter Quint that's possessing him. And there are also some pretty nasty implications that I was reading about Benjamin Britten and his relationship with boys. In all the biographies that I read and quotes that people said about him, there was this kind of underlying fear when he would interact with boys. He often cast boys in his operas, either boy choruses or boy roles. But in the digging that I did, I never found any actual evidence for a relationship. Nothing was mentioned. In fact, the actor who played Miles, David Hemmings, said, "Of all the people I have worked with, I count my relationship with Ben to have been one of the finest. Was I aware of his homosexuality? Yes, I was. Was I aware that he had a proclivity for young boys? Yes, I was. Did I find that threatening? No." And to me, that really summed it up, that these were more rumors than actual evidence of a relationship. And I think that these rumors spurred from this fear and not knowing what homosexuality was, from homophobia. The term homosexuality or homosexual didn't appear until 1892 in the Cyclopaedia Sexualis. And in my opinion, the lack of a word implies the lack of an understanding of something. And that lack of understanding or acceptance then, of course, leads to fear of the unknown. So really, the term homosexual had only been around for, what was that? Not even a little over 60 years at that point. So, of course, there were all of this fear around Benjamin Britten and this unacceptance within Britten himself. This struggle that Miles feels between wanting to be who he is, but also wanting to suppress that, I'm bad, aren't I, literally leads to his death in the end of the opera. There is a really tragic scene where Peter Quint and the governess are fighting over Miles's soul, and he dies in that conflict. So where does this take us? What is the future for children of opera? Well, there are a few things that I would love to see. Of course, the last opera that we talked about together was from 1954. It is now 2021, and still there's not that many stories that tell children's stories or that focus on children. So there are a few things I would love to see. Operas showing the struggles that children face with child actors portraying those roles. The third Dr. Schildkret that I mentioned, my older sister, works in the Theater for Young Audiences department at Kennedy Center. So this is what they do. They put on plays for children and teenagers. And the Theater for Youth category thinks that any play that tells the story of a child, that is considered theater for young audiences, if it's either told from their perspective, from first person, or if we're centered on their experience. So that moves completely away from the fairy tale genre. Fairy tales, of course, are still great stories. We learn a lot from them. But at Kennedy Center, they're doing plays about gun violence, about sexuality, about race, about all of these stories that kids need to talk about because it is their lives that they're seeing on stage. I think we're learning this in the entertainment industry, that inclusion is really important because we all need to see ourselves portrayed either on stage or on screen, seeing our own struggles and seeing people like us overcoming those struggles. And I think that's really important for children. And the work that I've done with children, either teaching them or performing for them, I see that children really are capable of a lot. They know a lot, and anybody who has children will know that they don't like when they feel like they're being talked down to. And so I think that's what opera can do, is show children up on stage for them to see. One thing that you might have noticed as we were talking about this evolution of child roles is that everything that happened was for boys, not for girls. I don't think that's really surprising to anybody who knows history. But of course, trouser roles were male characters. The first choruses that appeared were boys' choruses. The principal roles that we talked about were boys playing those roles. Even so much so in Turn of the Screw, I mentioned there are two children in that, Miles and his younger sister Flora. But Flora is written for and portrayed by a woman. So historians talk about this too, that women and children were viewed really similarly in the 19th century, that they both were the epitome of innocence, that the ideal woman, of course, was virginal, that in a way had a prepubescent sense of sexuality, that they needed to be protected at all costs. And so when we're not seeing girls being portrayed differently from women, I think that just perpetuates that conversation. And I can tell you, as a woman, I am very different from when I was a little girl. And I think if you if you are a parent of girls, you see that as well. So that's important for girls as well to see themselves on stage. I was lucky enough that I grew up with amazing child characters like Hermione. Or right now, I'm reading The Golden Compass, which has Lyra in the main character, seeing these girls being strong-willed and smart and taking control. Girls need to see that. And of course, the final thing is something that we are calling for in all realms of opera, which is more diversity. Like I mentioned, we all need to see ourselves on stage. So, of course, because we're talking about Western opera, most of the stories that we're seeing portrayed for children are about boys, but about white boys, right? And I think it's really important that children of all races are portrayed, that we see children who are non-binary, see children exploring sexuality, kind of like they do, and Miles is doing in Turn of the Screw, but maybe with more of a positive outcome than poor Miles has. So that is what I would ask for. If I would love to take questions now. We have like 15 or so minutes left. Let's see if I can see here. Yes, so the question, going back to what are great operas to take children to see? So, of course, there's more plays, I would say, that are specifically written for children, but there are some operas as well that I think really translate well for children. And of course, we're still waiting for new operas to be written, but one of my favorites is The Magic Flute. That does some great storytelling about good versus evil. There are also problems in The Magic Flute, as anything would be from the late 18th century, but it's a great first opera for kids because it starts with a dragon. It has magic. It has a lot of things that captivate children, that they love to see. I will say, too, that when we bring our shows to schools, our shorter versions of operas, we have had overwhelmingly good responses to that. We haven't had children being like, what is this? This sounds weird, but they are captivated. I think they're really captivated by seeing the power of the human voice when it doesn't have a microphone amplifying it. They're amazed by what we're able to do, and I think that empowers them to see, wow, I can use my voice in such a cool way. Ah, I love this. It would blow my nephew's mind to see someone his age singing on stage, especially AAPI like us. Yes, absolutely, right? Unfortunately, with the recent violence that we had against Asian populations, we know that race does not just include black and white, it's all races, and we need to see it all, right? And of course, take that as a grain of salt coming from a white woman, but I am 100% for amplifying all voices, even if that means I need to sit down and let another voice talk. But yeah, kids love seeing other kids on stage. I know I did. That was a big reason why I wanted to be a performer, is I loved watching other people on stage. And if I saw a child in a play or in some performance, I was so inspired by that. And it does take, of course, a little bit of imagination on the composer's part to be sure to write music that a child can sing, but it's absolutely doable, right? Awesome. All right. How do kids get cast in opera roles if they are new but talented? Great question. So the first opera that I was in actually was La Boheme. It was through the children's chorus. So that's usually a great way to go about, is to be involved in some sort of arts organization for children, whether it's a children's chorus or we're lucky enough in the Valley that we have Child's Play and Valley Youth Theater. Of course, they're doing musicals and plays, not necessarily opera, but when Arizona Opera is looking for child roles, oftentimes we go to like Phoenix Boys Choir or Tucson children's choruses in the area. So that's usually a great way to go about. You can also, there's an awesome resource called durantcom.com, which lists all performing opportunities and auditions around the Valley. So you can even search for adult or child, paid, non-paid, that sort of thing. Yes. What are some of the most impactful shows you saw as a child that featured children? We're interested in your best memories. Oh, great question. So I think the first show that I saw that featured children was probably Cavalleria Rusticana, which is a one-act opera. And that had, my sister was in the opera chorus for that. I was really young. I think I was probably 5 or 6 at the time. But I was also lucky enough that both my parents are in the performing arts. My father, who you heard from last month, is a choral director. My mom is a dance teacher. And so I think more I would see my mom's students dancing. And I actually, when I was a kid, I got to be in Amal and the Night Visitors because my mom was choreographing a scene for the shepherds. They do a shepherd's dance to entertain the kings. And I came to every rehearsal and I memorized that whole dance and I was doing it in the living room. And finally, Mom went to the music director and was like, "I'm so sorry to ask this. Is there any way we can put Miriam in it? She is like driving us crazy." Oh, hopefully I wasn't driving them crazy, but, and I got to be one of the dancers. I learned the music really quickly. Yeah, so Amal had a special place in my heart. It's amazing. Any other questions? Let's see. And I think, too, not necessarily impactful shows, but also just stories in general. I mentioned Hermione. I was a big Harry Potter fan when I was a kid. And so I still, as an adult, I love reading young adult fiction because I find it easier to read at the end of the night. But also, the stories that they're telling about those kids are amazing. Some of my favorites that I read in the last year was The Hate You Give. That is a tough one to read, but very important, about police brutality. Also, the book Pet, which is amazing. That's written by a non-binary author, and the main character is Black and transgender. But what I loved about the story is it's a story about a transgender character that isn't facing violence for being transgender. The conflict has nothing to do with their trans nature, which I loved. It's a great book. Highly recommend. Any other questions? Right. Well, thank you all so much again for being here. It was my pleasure to talk with you. We hope to see you at another lecture or maybe when we're back in a performing space. So have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day, and we hope to see you next time.
Dr. Miriam Schildkret, thank you so much for an informative presentation with a little mini performance there. Please do share this if you were watching and you think someone might like to watch it after the fact. As we mentioned at the top of the hour, the shows do stay on our YouTube channel, and we're so grateful to Arizona Opera for pivoting so quickly with us to present these in the virtual format while we can't have anyone in the venue. Your support is so important, and we love when you watch and ask questions. Some great questions today, so thank you to everyone watching for that. The next Coffee at Kerr will be in April, so we do hope you'll tune in for that. We'll have another presentation and mini performance, so we do hope you'll tune in for that either live or after the fact. And again, this week, Chinobe in our Beam series. He'll be playing African world music, doing some live looping and sampling. Those are evening shows that start at 7 p.m., so we do hope you can tune in for that. Chat, ask questions. He's a philanthropist and has also done several shows in person here at Kerr. Last time it was with his Dance of Hope ensemble, which is made up of Ugandan refugee children that he's trained to do several things with: music, dance, art, crafts. We saw so many great pieces of Ugandan art that they brought in, all these handmade drums. And so his live performance as a solo artist is going to be very similar to that instrumentally. And you'll see a lot of the soothing African instruments that he's made. He is great to chat with, so we do hope you'll tune in for that. We have been doing free live streams since April 2020, and these shows do incur a cost. We had to quickly acquire the equipment necessary so we could do these, and we've been so grateful to have musicians, presenters, all kinds of interesting storytellers performing from the venue sometimes. And we really appreciate your support if you are able to contribute. You'll be supporting Arizona artists as we do paid evening performances when there aren't a lot of paid gigs to go around. So we do hope if you're inspired by our programming, maybe you'll stop by asukerr.com and click that gold Give Now button on your way off your device today. We love all the support we've gotten. Thank you. Even if you can't contribute, we appreciate when you watch, chat, ask questions. These events are really fun because we get to know you, we get to know the artists and the people that turn up to watch their shows. A lot of times it's friends and family members. So if you really want to get that full picture of the artists that we have on our live streams, please do tune in, subscribe on YouTube. You'll get notifications when we go live and you'll never miss a show. Thanks again, Dr. Miriam Schildkret. Thank you, Arizona Opera, and thank you, viewing audience. Have a great rest of your week.